Jeff the Baby Dolphin is a really interesting card, but for a card that I expected to be the best card of the season, it might actually be a bit of a letdown. Jeff is a 2/2 with movable, and cards played on Jeff's location reveal with +1 power. And the best way I can describe Jeff is as the culmination of a trend that I've begun talking about on this channel. I believe if you go far back enough to Ezekiel Sims, I'm talking about a paradigm shift in terms of what matters in Marvel Snap. Ezekiel Sims, Drax Avatar of Life. These are cards that are in the same vein as Jeff, where they read as extremely powerful and extremely relevant, and they're going to be good in whatever good cards pile. And the thing that I think maybe am refusing to accept is that good cards piles don't exist anymore, and we don't do those here. And Jeff especially feels to me like the culmination of this, because he is almost a really good synergy card in a bunch of spots. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if the future verdict on Jeff was something along the lines of like, this is a card that will be like 95% as good as the card that is the card in the deck. As an example, like the Jeff versions of the Captain Carter combo deck, they're probably a little bit worse than the Storm Horseman versions, but if you don't have Storm Horseman, Jeff is the best replacement you can get. And that's sort of the thing that seems to be the niche that he's developing right now. But largely, this is a card that is good at doing what it does, but what it does isn't particularly valued in the metagame right now. The metagame right now is about multiplicative scaling, and Jeff is about linear scaling. And I've said that about a million different cards over the years, right? I talked about the ones like Ezekiel Sims and Drax Avatar of Life, and we just fundamentally are in a world where people are doubling their stuff way more. Back in 2024, if you wanted to double stuff, you had to play Iron Man or Wong. Now you can play Mother Ascani and Grandmaster and Prodigy and Captain Carter and then Maverick and all of that stuff. And it doubles and doubles and doubles. And when you're doubling stuff, your input is really important, because if you start doubling at 2 and your opponent starts doubling at 1, well, you're going to end up being a lot bigger than them. When you play against those people, you're going to end up doing really strong things, and they're going to end up doing things that are slightly less strong. Similarly, if you're the best things in the game are doubling and doubling green power, they'll cause your opponents to play against things that are good at playing green power. And that means that a lot of the decks that Jeff wants to go in are sort of incidentally getting hated on because of the prevalence of other things in his niche. In other words, I am not confident that he is going to take the spot from Storm Horseman of Famine in the Captain Carter deck, although I do think he does a fairly passable, if not outright good job at replacing her if you don't have her. But I also think that that deck is drawing a lot of fire. It's making a lot of people play Shadow King, and everything Jeff wants to do, whether that be zombie-related things with Zombie Giant Man and Kitty Pryde, or Surfer-related things with Venus and Sebastian Shaw, all of those things get splash damage, no pun intended, I know it's a beach season, from the other things that are really good right now. So ultimately, while I do think that Jeff it's just very hard for me to envision a world where this card is not good. It is really difficult for me to envision that world. But I do think that there's a very real possibility that all you have to do to envision that world is look around at the world that we're in right now. And I think that Jeff is releasing a lot less like a 4.5-star card like I thought he would be, and a lot more like a 3 or 3.5-star card with the potential to go upwards when something changes. He's better than Drax Avatar of Life, I think. He's better than Ezekiel Sims, I'm pretty sure. And still, he's in that group of guys who are good, but just haven't been what the metagame is about in an extended period of time. I still hold out some hope here. Maybe I'm holding out some cope that Jeff is going to be a solid card at some point in the future, or even an actively great card at some point in the future. For most of Marvel Snap's lifetime, this would have been one of the best cards in the game, basically immediately on release. This is a very specific moment that it is releasing into. I do think it's very possible that this is a card that just sort of releases awkward and doesn't necessarily get to the point that it wants to on release, but eventually finds its way into a more balanced and fair metagame than the current one we live in. There are still some homes for Jeff that we should talk about, but largely the thing to take away from this video is that he right now serves less as a master of any one thing and more a bit like a Jeff of all trades. Now, we are going to start with the Surfer builds here. I have two, they're not even Surfer builds, the Captain Carter builds here. This one is a lot more mid-rangey, and we've reduced the combo stuff down to just the stuff that we actually want to combo off with. Like, if you look at every card that costs more than 2 in this deck, it is a combo piece. There is Brood, who is the result of our combo, Captain Carter, an engine, Maverick, an engine. I guess Hope Summers, technically, true, not a combo piece, but Prodigy, Stick, Mother Haskani, those 6 cards minus Hope Summers are the combo engine of this deck, and then the rest of it is just sort of putting things together. Now, I do think that it's possible that this gives up on a few too many backup plans, so there is another version as well that has more backup plans, but realistically, these are really backup plans where 100% of games you play, you should be trying to combo and not going for this stuff, so that does matter. What I have enjoyed is Sam Wilson allowing me to do cool Prodigy stuff. I have enjoyed all the combos that are still in this list, but I do think that ultimately you're gonna feel the loss of Storm in a meaningful way. I've also seen this Surfer list running around, and I think it's an interesting direction for the archetype to take itself, which is to say, this is a deck that is sort of forcing itself to be a Surfer deck. This is a deck that's like, all right, what if we just played like we are a Surfer deck? And so because we want to use our buffs on the board, we don't want to be a version of the Storm deck, but I do find it hard to believe that in most games, your best line is going to involve the cards Silver Surfer and Venus. I think they're mostly here to make you feel better about playing this deck than they are to win games. I'm not saying it's like specifically a bad choice. This is still like 10 cards of the best deck in the game. So there's a pretty high floor on how bad it can possibly be. But I do think that you are giving up some minimal things by playing either of these decks over the stock version that we've been playing for the last bit or so, and I think that ultimately that will bear out over time. What these decks gain, though, is they are dramatically easier to play, and there is a part of me that wants to acknowledge that as a meaningful upside. There are a lot of people who would benefit from just playing the easier versions of the deck, and I do think that especially this version is just like super easy, super straightforward. We'll talk about Venus, I believe, in tomorrow's video, but she's been a card that I think is really interesting to contrast with Jeff specifically, because Venus is a card that there's been a lot more excitement in deck building around because she goes in a bunch of stuff that isn't very good and does make that stuff better. And one of those things is a traditional Surfer list that is using Venus to make sure that Surfer says he gives +3. And that's a really cool thing to do. And if that's your backup plan, it's a very fine thing to do. It should not be your baseline frontal plan, so to speak, because this is just a better plan A to have. But Venus is really exciting because she is taking these discrete packages of cards and making those discrete packages stronger. Whereas Jeff is releasing a little bit slower because he's not actually built to do anything specific. And I think that's a really important dynamic of this card, where it's like you look at it and you're like, oh, this is a card that goes in a move deck and it's a card that goes in a buff deck, right? But it's not an A1 card that goes in either, right? So this is a card that maybe can go in a Batroc deck and you won't be mad about it, but it's not a card that you love to have in a Batroc deck. It's just like pretty good because the cap on this card is pretty good because it's never going to be great or game winning unless you take all the buffs and double them, right? And you can put this in the buff deck and it's pretty good, and it's never going to be more than pretty good, where something like Storm could be way more than pretty good, right? Whereas Venus doesn't have that kind of competition a lot of the time. Like the decks Venus is going in are just not decks that are actually competing, that have like meaningful competition for her in the same way. There isn't another card you can play in a zombies deck, which we're about to put on the screen, that makes each of your zombies proc a little bit more. That card doesn't exist. So Venus has no competition, so you don't have to compare her to anything. And so I think a lot of people are going to come out of this video, the next video, and the next couple days and be like, Venus is better than Jeff because Venus is going in a lot more decks. But all of those decks are worse than Surfer too. And so like there's this thing that's happening where because Jeff has stiff competition, there's a lot of things in the buff space doing really strong stuff. Whereas a lot of Venus decks, there's no competition. There are no other cards you can play that you can put in your zombie deck where it says whenever you hoard +1. There just aren't other cards that do that. There are no other cards in that space. And that is a big thing that I think is going to make people feel good about Venus and feel bad about Jeff, but it might not necessarily be how things are in a real sense. Because when you line up a deck like this, the zombie stuff is super cool. I love this archetype. It is one of the coolest things in Marvel Snap. It is an incredibly tough ask to play the deck that loses to Shadow King Grandmaster and loses to Copying Gambits. It is just a hard ask, and this is cool. This is awesome. But I do find it very likely that this is not a serious contender going forward, as much as I would really, truly, honestly love it to be. And I think that's one of the things where you see that people will feel a certain way about Venus because there is no competition. They'll feel like this deck is better than it is because they finally have an excuse to play it again. But realistically, I think either of the Surfer decks with Jeff are better than this, and I think both of the Surfer decks with Jeff are probably worse than the Surfer deck with Storm. And so maybe I'm being harsh on Jeff because I have higher expectations of him. I'm not sure. So we've talked about the problems with Jeff. What are some areas where he's actively improving things? Well, he's a free include in Zombie Galacti, which is a deck that loves having buffs onto Maverick, onto Zombie Galacti, onto a guaranteed activated Superior Spider-Man. This is the Jaywala Elsa Zombie Galacti list that I particularly like because it's just so mid-rangey and goofy. It's the mid-rangiest of all mid-rangey Zombie Galacti lists. Unfortunately, Zombie Galacti is in an awkward position at the top of the metagame because whenever you're playing against one of those other combo decks, the Surfer, Captain Carter things, they have a very real chance at going taller than you. And I think that the removal of magic from this list, often something that I praise, is specifically contextually valuable because the Surfer Carter decks are actually just better at using magic than you are as a normal Zombie Galacti deck. This is a dope list that I think genuinely benefits from Jeff, but I think, again, you really have to look for specific lists that are actually going to fit what Jeff is doing rather than just slapping him into a buff deck and saying that's the best buff deck, or a move deck and saying that's the best move deck. By the way, there would be the multiple man list on here, but Jeff doesn't work like Proscenium does for some reason, and I don't know if that's a bug, because Jeff, well, the way Proscenium works with multiple man is when a multiple man goes back to Proscenium, it gets a buff as if it was a card that revealed. I don't know if that's the bug or if Jeff not doing that is the bug, but Jeff doesn't do that, and if he did, I think he'd be a real contender there too. Last up is Jounce, which obviously this is a deck that can very easily afford to play a Jeff on turn 2 and move him out of the way whenever you want to do like one of the big bounce stuff and just use him to acquire extra points over the course of the game. This is a deck that moves its own stuff out of Jeff lanes with cards like Falcon and Grandmaster, and is just generally Jeff is just going to represent a lot of points in a deck like this, which is actually a fairly relevant thing. This is such a sick bounce list. Like, I really can't stress just how good this archetype would be if other things weren't holding it back right now. But I do think that as the metagame swings more towards being Shadow King-y, being a deck that's like stressing other people on Mobius lines might end up being a little more valuable here. So this Sasquatch Mother Ascani stuff, if people are playing a bunch of Shadow King, that's really, really cool. You get to throw priority very well. You really don't want to see the Invisible Woman Shadow King stuff because you are still a Hitmonkey deck, but you do have a lot of very powerful output and priority throwing abilities if they're not doing that. And I think that that's a really interesting direction. What holds this deck back is points, right? And Jeff is actually meaningfully alleviating that. Jeff is just going to play, if you play him on turn 2, that's a 2/8, maybe more, and it's going to be wherever you want it to be. Like it just, you're gonna fill up those locations. It's not gonna matter. That's what this deck does. If you are ever not getting less than a 2/8 out of it, it's just not really worth doing. This is a really genuinely decent addition here. Like, I don't want to like crap all over Jeff. It's just that I think I expected him to be, bang, this guy's awesome, he's doing cool stuff immediately, and instead it's like, well, the metagame doesn't really allow him to reach his full potential, and now I've got to do all these caveats and stuff. And so, again, like, I could be being a little harsh on the nice little shark dolphin man, but I do think that this is a case where the harshness of the metagame is dictating the power of this card. And I don't want to just immediately lump it in the Sims box, so to speak, because it's definitely better than that. I think it's probably better than Drax Avatar of Life, but those are the cards it comps to, I think, a lot more than a dedicated combo card. So, where are we on this card? My instinct is that I think a lot of people might be disappointed with him, is sort of where I feel a little disappointed with him. I think he's good, and I think, like, if you're playing a Kitty Pryde deck, that's a reasonable thing to be doing, and putting this in there is, like, very, very cool, but, like, I just don't know that I wanna be playing a Kitty Pryde deck right now, and fundamentally, the problems with this card are almost all related to the Captain Carter buff deck. Either the fact that he doesn't necessarily go in there, like, I think he's, like, 90% as good as Storm, but he's not as good as her, and the fact that it is going to draw a lot of fire, right? Like, everything this guy does is adding green power. And so everything you play him with is adding green power. And so everything you play him with is losing to Shadow King. And everyone is playing Shadow King because of the buff deck. And so he manages to not actually go in the deck that's drawing all the fire and still fall victim to all the fire at the same time. And so when I talk about this metagame being hostile, that's really what I mean. I'm holding out hope. But I will say that I think that my initial rating of this is a 4.5-star card. I thought I was being a little pessimistic. I think that's really optimistic at this point. This is a card that I think is going to be nice for you to have, but will require specific metagames to really show up and be dominant. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.